In this video, we're going to take a look at Pythagorean Theorem, which is a theorem that deals with the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. We should know that the right triangle is made up of two legs that form the right angle, and across from it is the hypotenuse. Pythagorean theorem is named after a philosopher mathematician from ancient Greece called Pythagoras. So he discovered this relationship a long time ago. Actually, that might not be totally true. He kind of discovered Pythagorean theorem in the same way that Columbus discovered America, which means he didn't. This discovery has actually shown up in multiple cultures before Pythagoras was ever born.
Oh no!
Let's take a look at the key principle of Pythagorean theorem, which is shown in our most basic example that demonstrates Pythagorean theorem. So if you look at this diagram, if you form squares off of each side of the triangle, notice that if you count up the squares coming off the legs, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. If you add those up, you get 25, which is the amount of squares coming off the hypotenuse. So this can be written as leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Or if you want to abbreviate it, you can just call it L squared plus L squared equals H squared. Now, if you go searching on the internet or textbooks, they always refer to this as A squared plus B squared equals C squared. I've never actually liked to call it that because the A and the B and the C just seem to be the first 3 letters of the alphabet, but they don't really tell you what the sides are. So until we start referring to the legs as A leg, B leg, and the hypotenuse, I'm going to stick with L squared plus L squared equals H squared. Another reason to stick with L squared plus L squared equals H squared is that when we get into trigonometry with right triangles, we are going to constantly be labeling our opposite leg, our adjacent leg, and our hypotenuse. So we might as well stress the idea that we have a leg, and a hypotenuse by calling them that. Leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared, instead of that more popular A squared plus B squared equals C squared. The most common use of Pythagorean theorem is solving for the missing side of a right triangle. Let's go ahead and take a look at a problem, and we'll take notes on how to solve for the missing side of a right triangle. So the first step that you do is label your hypotenuse. And the way you can find your hypotenuse is you can draw an arrow to the side across from the right angle. So you can go ahead and draw an arrow from your right angle to the opposite side. That would go to the 13 and label that as your hypotenuse, and you can just abbreviate that H. Second step is to go ahead and label the other sides as legs. Now we're ready to go ahead and substitute into our Pythagorean theorem of L squared plus L squared equals H squared. Hey, until you get really good at this, you might want to write out the L squared plus L squared equals H squared first, and then we're substituting in our values. So we end up with x squared plus 12 squared equals 13 squared. The fourth step would be to square your numbers and then solve for your variable. So when we square our numbers out, we get x squared plus 144 equals 169. Then we would subtract 144 from both sides, leaving us with x squared equals 25. And taking the square root of this would give us our answer of 5. Now technically negative 5 also makes x squared equal 25, but it doesn't make sense to have a negative length, so we don't consider that as an answer. At this point, you should pause the video and make sure that you've written down all these steps with this example. These will be the notes that you can use in the future on working out these types of problems. Let's go ahead and jump right in and try another problem. Your choice. You may want to pause the video and try this on your own, or you can do it with me step by step. So the first thing we want to do is draw an arrow from our right angle to the opposite side. that shows us where the hypotenuse is. So we're going to label that. Next up, label your legs. And my advice, until you get really good at this, let's write down our L squared plus L squared equals H squared. And now go ahead and carefully substitute in your values into your equation. So we got 2 squared plus 6 squared equals n squared. Go ahead and square those numbers. So 4 plus 36 equals n squared. Add that together, and we get 40 equals n squared, which means we can say our answer is radical 40. So that's a correct answer, but you could do other things with that. You could take the radical 40, and remember, if you can divide out a perfect square, you can simplify the radical. So if we divide by 4, we get radical 4 times radical 10, and then the square root of 4 simplifies to 2, so we have 2 radical 10. You could also just put this into the calculator and turn it into a decimal, which would give us 6.325. This time, go ahead and pause the video, try out these two problems, and then hit play to check your answers. So on the first one, you should draw your arrow from your right angle to the opposite side, label that your hypotenuse. Next up, you have 2 legs, and you can write L squared plus L squared equals H squared. Then substitute in your values, and then go ahead and square the 9 and square the 15 to give you x squared plus 81 equals 225. Subtract 81 from both sides. X squared equals 144, which is a perfect square. So x equals 12. And this time I did give you units of measurement, so we should write that x is 12 meters. All right, on the second problem, draw your arrow, label that side your hypotenuse. The other 2 sides are your legs. And then if you're used to L squared plus L squared equals H squared, if you want to just go straight to putting it into that form, just carefully get everything in the right spot, and you get 10 squared plus 6 squared equals n squared. If you wrote 6 squared first and then 10 squared, that's fine. The order of the legs doesn't matter, but make sure the hypotenuse gets in the right spot. From there, we square these 2 numbers, add them together, and then our answer could be radical 136. We can actually simplify this because you can divide 136 by 4, giving you radical 4 times radical 34. And then you simplify the radical 4 into 2 radical 34. So our final answer is 2 radical 34 inches. That would be your exact answer. You could also put it in the calculator and turn it into a decimal and have 11.662 inches. Either way it worked. Now we have just one more thing to look at about the Pythagorean theorem. The last thing we're going to look at is using Pythagorean theorem to determine if a triangle is a right triangle. So to do this, we have to substitute values into the equation, and if both sides are equal, then it is a right triangle. So here's a possible problem. The question is that a right triangle? So first we have to know where our hypotenuse is, and the other 2 will be legs. Now we just substitute this into L squared plus L squared equals H squared. But we're not saying it's equal. We're asking, is it equal? Let's find out. So 3 squared is 9, 5 squared is 25, and 6 squared is 36. And when we go 9 plus 25, we get 34 equals 36. Well, that is not true. So that means not a right triangle. Let's try another one. So this time, instead of a picture, it just says in words that we have a triangle with sides of 6, 10, and 8. So in the last problem, we said the 6 was the hypotenuse because it looks like it might be the hypotenuse. The truth is, that 6 would be the hypotenuse because it is the longest side. If you have a right triangle, your longest side has to be the hypotenuse. So in this case, the 10 is the hypotenuse, and the 6 and the 8 would have to be the legs, assuming that it works out. Let's find out. So we'll plug this into L squared plus L squared equals H squared. We're asking the question, is this equal? So we'll go ahead and square our numbers. And when we add 36 plus 64, we get 100 equals 100. So that time, it's true. It made the equation true. So that means a triangle with sides of 6, 10, and 8, it's a right triangle. And that will go ahead and conclude our video on Pythagorean Theorem.